Thank you very much for having me today and for the welcome. And I'm sorry I can't be with you in person today. What I'll be talking about today is research that we have done on the public views on road pricing. Several caveats here. One is that this is not looking at the modeling of costs and benefits or any economic evaluation of different kinds of road pricing, but purely what the public think of the different framings for road pricing and of the different options for a system going forward. The other one is obviously that it is UK based on the research, I'm assuming that that there's basic sort of knowledge of the central versus local government system in the UK, which is similar to many other countries. But if there are any questions that I need to clarify at the end, let me know. And the last one is to please not share these findings just yet externally, because we're not publishing our report until the 29th of this month. We'll have to postpone it a couple of times because of things happening, obviously, in the UK. So if you move to the next slide, please. This slide is sort of difficult with the formatting there, but this report is based within the context, obviously, of revenues declining in the UK from vehicle taxation. Because of the shift to electric vehicles, as we've been discussing over the last couple of days, in the UK, the Treasury has said that it intends to keep revenues from motor taxation broadly the same. And this is for a number of reasons, and mainly because other options are less palatable. So, for example, if you increased other taxes like income tax or VAT, that would be unfair on non-drivers. If you introduce new taxes, for example, a tax on electricity, obviously that would be controversial, and new taxation has already been ruled out by the current administration. If you want to increase borrowing, that would be seen as imprudent in the context of recent borrowing increases to deal with the cost of COVID and energy bill support. If you want to reduce public services and make do with less revenue overall, so if there was less funding for hospitals and schools or road maintenance and transport, that would be seen as unfair on society as a whole, and it would damage, obviously, economic recovery. So reforming vehicle taxation then becomes a necessity. And road pricing, or distance-based road pricing, so I'm talking about a national system of taxation reform for the purpose of obviously generating tax revenue, as opposed to local schemes that account for congestion and pollution. That seems to be the obvious choice when it comes to taxation reform. The broad framing that we've used in this report is the fiscal imperative, because obviously that is the context within the government is thinking about this policy. But obviously there are other benefits, as we've discussed this week, these couple of days. So it would help rebalance the pricing signals between driving and public transport. Electric vehicles at the moment in the UK pay no tax at all for ownership or for running costs. It would then have the impact of reducing vehicle kilometers and then corresponding decline in congestion, pollution, and vehicle emissions. And it would more accurately reflect the externalities from specific journeys. And finally, it would improve fairness and transparency, which is lacking within the current system that we have in the UK with fuel duty and vehicle excise duty. The difficulty is that politicians have long seen road pricing as a toxic topic, and that's because in the past proposals have been obviously overturned because of negative public sentiment. But it has been several years since the public's views on road pricing, on congestion charging, have been tested in the UK. Our research is the most extensive look at public transport, at public views on road pricing in recent years. It was based on several focus groups that we conducted for different segments of society. It was based on a very in-depth survey, 60-question survey of over 3,000 people, which was nationally representative, as well as experts, roundtable, and stakeholder interviews. Move to the next slide, please. Now, we found that there is broad agreement on the need for reform. So first of all, what we did was to test people's views of the current system and whether they believe that the current system should be reformed and why. The two main framings that we tested was the decline in revenue from taxation, because people are switching to electric vehicles and the need to pay for public services. But we also tested the framing that the current system is confusing, not very transparent, so drivers can't really keep an eye on how much they're paying in tax, and that's because fuel duty is charged within the overall price of fuel at the pumps. So many people misunderstand or miscalculate how much they're actually paying for taxation. And both of those framings elicited similar responses from the public. So in both of these contexts, the public believe that there is the case for reform. Next slide, please. And then what we did was to introduce the view that road pricing or pay-as-you-drive is an option for reforming the current system of vehicle taxation. So replacing fuel duty and BED with a pay-as-you-drive system of different sort of descriptions. And to test how people's views changed from that initial sort of broad description of what pay-as-you-drive is to the end of the survey when different options have been explored. And while there was a net support at the start, at 41% of people supportive of replacing VD and fuel duty with pay-as-you-drive versus 21% thinking that it's a bad idea. Towards the end of the survey, this grew to half of people, 49% supportive of the idea, and only 18% thinking that it might still be a bad idea. But as you can see, there has been a switch from people feeling negatively about it or being uncertain to switching to a more positive view. So that shows that when the arguments are explained and people engage with the discussion of the benefits and potential costs and how these can be mitigated, there's a potential to increase public support further rather than this knee-jerk reaction that people might have in the beginning. Next slide, please. We then again tested the arguments for and against replacing the current system with pay-as-you-drive to see which ones people found convincing or not convincing. So what we found was that there is a broad understanding and agreement among the general public that EVs need to start paying tax. While policymakers in England have been concerned that obviously electric vehicles have been free of taxation from purchase time, and whether introducing the taxation would then slow down the uptake of electric vehicles. We see that the general public understand that sooner or later that sort of tax-free regime needs to end. And in fact, many people think that it's only fair that EVs should start paying tax like all other drivers. So it's in the context of fairness and people thinking that other drivers shouldn't get away with paying nothing compared to other drivers. And people understand that sort of framing, that the money has to come from somewhere. They understand that the government needs to be responsible with public funding and that this revenue needs to be replaced. So there's a quote there which illustrates that if the system is designed in such a way that there's relative fairness between electric cars and other petrol and diesel cars, then that's a sensible thing to do. And this is illustrated in the next slide as well, where we looked at different options for regimes So many people, so some experts are saying, well, if the issue is that EVs are not charged, then why don't you just tax EVs and leave the rest of the system as it is? Now, there is net support for this option, which is the first column. But when we discussed it in focus groups, then people felt that two different systems might be confusing, might be more complicated. So we can see here in the second option that any charge needs to apply to all drivers so that it's consistent and fair, elicits a greater support than an EV-only system. So on balance, I feel that the third option, where EVs should be charged alongside other vehicles, but at a lower rate than petrol and diesel cars, that is the sort of option that encapsulates both of those views, and it's something that we should be striving towards. Next slide, please. We also, there was also, people were quite attracted at another sort of framing of the benefits of moving towards pay as you drive, and that was the prospect of paying less. So when we looked at the arguments for and against pay as you drive, the strongest argument for reform was that it would mean that those that drive less will pay less tax. Now, to an extent, this is already the case with fuel duty, because it's a set price per liter of fuel, whether it's petrol or diesel, and regardless of people's vehicle efficiency and how much they actually, how much it costs to pay per mile. But people felt that if this tax was pulled out of the cost of fuel at the pump, and it became more transparent and upfront and more clear, which is what the quote on the right is illustrating, then that would be a reason for people to be more mindful of their driving, more mindful of their consumption, and then it would be an incentive for them to drive less and then save money that way. So the transparency part of it makes it more obvious for them that they can save money. And obviously, the way that the rates are set can reflect that for the majority of people that drive a low amount of mileage per year. They could genuinely save money in this way. Another thing to add is that no, sorry, I forgot the point I was going to make here, but no, sorry. In terms of, it will be more fair that the amount paid per mile would then not reflect so directly on vehicle efficiency. So there's inherent unfairness that poorer people that might drive less fuel efficient cars pay more per mile than richer people that can afford newer vehicles and more fuel efficient vehicles. So recalibrating this can improve fairness from this perspective as well. Next slide, please. So then in the focus groups and in the survey, we explored the main options for how this reform can happen. And in our view, there are three main viable options for national distance-based charging. The first one is a flat per mile charge for EVs only. So as I explained, that has some inherent attractions. It is simple, it's a relatively low amount of vehicles to implement reforms for. It's easier to implement, it's easier to understand as well. And it won't require vehicle tracking. You can just charge per mile, a set per mile cost for EVs only. But as I said, it doesn't tackle the transparency and lack of fairness in the current system. It creates two different systems, and people think that's confusing. And also, it doesn't obviously reflect location and the availability of alternatives. And even though petrol and diesel vehicles will be phased out from 2030. So there'll be, in the UK, we're stopping the sale of petrol and diesel vehicles from 2030, but those vehicles purchased up to now will obviously be on the road for many years to come. So then you've got no leverage about impacting on vehicle use for those cars as well. Now, the attraction of replacing fuel duty in VED for all vehicles is that these issues will be tackled. So petrol and diesel vehicles, you have a leverage, you have a more subtle way of impacting driver behavior and also of giving tax benefits as well to all drivers. We feel that this needs to be varied by emissions at the very least. But that means that in a static system where you're not monitoring location, then you can only charge obviously different rates for different vehicle emissions. But again, to only enforce that by reading the odometer of the vehicle. So again, you wouldn't need tracking. And that is a very attractive system for politicians that want to keep the system simple. The big downside of this is that you're penalizing people that have no alternatives. So you're not reflecting of where the journey takes place, whether it's an urban or rural location, whether people have alternatives to driving. And as I'll show later, that is the main concern that people have of moving to a distance-based system. So you need something to account for people's alternatives to driving. So people feel that it's inherently unfair that they're being charged more if they can't change their behavior, if they have no other options, whereas people in urban areas might switch to a bus, and that might be cheaper to them for them to drive. One way to mitigate against that, and I'll talk a little bit more later, is to have a set tax-free mileage allowance. And you could potentially allocate more free miles to people that live in rural areas than people that live in urban areas. And that then is not a perfect reflector of every journey, because obviously people in urban areas can make long journeys elsewhere in the country, and then their options in those journeys might be limited as well. But it's a proxy in a sense. The third option is a fully smart per mile charge, which is variable based on location and time of day, as well as emissions. So in this option is the one where you need to track the vehicle. And that most accurately reflects the impact of different vehicles and different journeys. It encourages the uptake of cleaner vehicles. It reduces congestion if you're driving off peak. You account for that alternative availability. But it's more complicated and it requires vehicle tracking, so it will be more costly to implement as well. And policymakers have for a long time thought that this need to track vehicles is what the public are opposed to, because that is what campaigns against road pricing in the past have centered around. But as we'll see from the next slide, the people are not inherently opposed to in-vehicle tracking. So when we looked at the different options for technology to implement pay-as-you-drive, black boxes to track mileage and roadside cameras were the technology that people disliked. And this is because people associated that with being watched, with Big Brother, with sort of tracking, where people are driving and at what speeds. People felt that they might be charged for speeds, contraventions and so on. But the odometer and the MOT checking, so the options where you don't need to track the location, that was the top option. But actually the inbuilt GPS and telematics in the vehicle to track location was not far behind. So actually people were equally split between the non-tracking and the tracking option. And it's a similar sort of reception to the inbuilt telematics that lots of new cars already have. And the in-vehicle additional plug-in device that will be required for vehicles that don't have this technology and will require that retrofitting. So the takeaway here is that people are actually not as opposed to tracking, but also a lot of people, when we offered mitigations against this for people to improve their privacy and if people wanted to not be tracked, then offering an opt-out from distance-based charging is a very viable option as well. So in a sense, you can have a hybrid system where you're tracking vehicles that want to save money. But if you don't want to be tracked, then you have this option to pay a set charge per year, which would cost you more than if you're tracked. But that gets you out of, having to have your vehicle tracked if you're opposed in principle to this. Next slide, please. So in terms of mitigations, as I said, the main barrier and argument against pay-as-you-drive was that people that have no option shouldn't be charged more. So 69% of people said that they would be more supportive if public transport was made cheaper or with improved connectivity as a way to make the system cheaper and fairer. So a big part of selling, if you will, road pricing to the public would be to say, if you don't have the alternatives at the moment, you'll be charged less, and we will invest in those alternatives so that the options for people are improved in the future. The big benefit of having mitigations, though, is that when you enter a smarter system that can vary, so either by offering complete exemptions to people or lower per mile rates or a higher tax-free mileage allowance, is that then you can target discounts or tax cuts to specific groups, say disabled people, people on low incomes, people in key roles in public society, instead of that blunt cutting fuel duty, so you're either cutting tax for everyone or no one. This system can be sold to people on the basis of being smarter and more targeted, and it will enable that sort of smarter policy when it comes to progressive tax cuts. But in terms of offering exemptions, then you need to be mindful of sort of people's skepticism that exemptions won't be abused. So if we look at on the right, and that's something we explored in focus groups, half of people felt that exemptions are necessary to mitigate for the large impact on people that can't afford the charge. But the other half felt that if you have exemptions, then people will abuse the system. They will find a way around, not paying the charge. So exemptions, in our view, should only be applied if absolutely necessary. It is better to perhaps have lower per mile rates for groups like disabled drivers, and then use the tax-free allowance perhaps to target those sort of tax cuts to specific groups better. Next slide, please. We also looked at how a national system of taxation should interact with any local system, so congestion charges, zero emission zones that are implemented at the city or local authority level. There was an overwhelming preference for the money to be raised and to be spent locally as opposed to just by central government. So more people believed, 3 times more people believed, that a proportion of the money should be given to local authorities to spend in the local area. And that's obviously because people feel that any improvements will then be more visible and impact them directly. And there was also preference for a scheme to be implemented by local leaders as opposed to national government. There was a big sort of sentiment in the focus groups about mistrusting governments, whether that's the current government or government in general. But when you gave people the option of sort of having a single system with then local top-ups versus having separate schemes at the national level and local level, people preferred a single system that is more consistent, as opposed to the confusion that different systems and different rates in different cities and nationally would then create for drivers. So we feel that this option option 3, which accounts for location and can basically charge more in urban areas or in locations with better alternatives, is the best solution long term. And last slide, please. In terms of conclusion and recommendations, we feel that there could be natural progressions between options 1 and 3. So starting with an EV-only system, or EV first rather, where EVs are used as a pilot for national road pricing to charge per distance. And then that early captures the EVs and addressing the problem that Stefan talked about, that as time progresses, obviously revenue will decline, and that revenue neutrality, you're then captured with a lower tax base. So if you go with EVs first, it addresses this problem. If you go to the middle option, where you're charging everyone, but not based on location, then it tackles the unfairness of fuel duty, but at a more acceptable level, perhaps. But then you could go straight to option 3, where you're charging per distance and location, but you give people the option to opt out and then effectively use option 2 for those that are not willing to be tracked. So that's obviously something for national governments to weigh up and decide on. Obviously, the less steps you have, the lower the option for things to be derailed along the way. So perhaps that sort of hybrid option will be the best one objectively. We think that any campaign for vehicle reform should focus on the need for revenue to keep track with the transition to net zero. People understand that. A focus on drive less and pay less, and helping people to tackle the cost of living. So those that are driving less should be paying less than they currently do. That will resonate with the current issues that we're all facing with the cost of living and high energy costs. Commitment to raise no more than the current system does. That is important to some people, and it sort of adds to that. It counters the view that, oh, the government will just use this system to clobber us with more taxes. If you commit to that, then you counter this argument. If you ring-fence at least a proportion of the revenue to road maintenance and public transport, then you're addressing that issue about lack of alternatives. If you then offer a tax-free mileage allowance, with potentially rural drivers paying more, receiving more mileage, free mileage, then you tackle that fairness issue, and also adds to the perception that your people are being supported with the cost of living. You provide suitable mitigations for disabled drivers, for sole traders, for businesses, and then have an arm's length body that sets the standards and the rates to tackle that inherent distrust in government. We feel that will be important. So what we've said, that in the UK, the current government should set a commission of cross-party representation of MPs and peers to reach agreement on the basic principle that we require need of reform of vehicle taxation. Ideally, parties would commit to this principle of reform in their manifestos ahead of the general election, and then the Commission would report after the next general election, so that the details of the recommendations are not used as a political football in the election campaign. But then the next government would consult on the preferred way forward, so that the scheme is ready to start implementation around 2025, when the revenue is projected to start declining in the UK. Thank you. That's the end of my presentation, and I look forward to questions.